This is the second of 3 stories, the same events told by a husband, wife, and lover. In each one you will find new unexpected discoveries and their point of view on the situation. In the coming days another story will appear on the channel. You will recognize them by the video cover, so pause and subscribe so you don't miss this story. Also, if you watch this video later, the link to the video will be pinned in the description below the video, and the first video is already pinned there, and at the end of the video. Thank you for your attention. You can watch them in any order. I continue the story. Sometimes desperation makes you do things you never thought possible, and by the time you realize how far you've fallen, it's already too late to climb back up. The worst part about losing everything isn't the loneliness or the shame, it's knowing that everyone thinks they understand your story when they only know half of it. My name is Sharon, and this is the truth about why I destroyed the life I loved more than anything else in the world. 2 years ago, Dr. Martinez looked at me across his desk and said the words that shattered my universe. Sharon, you have premature ovarian failure. Your hormone levels indicate rapid decline. If you want to have children, you need to act within the next 18 to 24 months, or it may become impossible. I sat in that sterile office, staring at the test results that might as well have been a death sentence for my dreams of motherhood. John was at work, completely unaware that our future was crumbling in a doctor's office across town. We'd been trying to conceive for 3 years. 3 years of negative pregnancy tests, 3 years of disappointed hopes, 3 years of wondering what was wrong with us. John never blamed me, never made me feel defective, but I could see the sadness in his eyes every month when my period arrived right on schedule. How do you tell the man you love that his dreams of fatherhood are slipping away because your body is failing? How do you explain that the woman he married, the woman he trusted to give him children, is fundamentally broken? I couldn't do it. Every time I looked at John's hopeful face, every time he mentioned baby names or talked about converting the spare room into a nursery, the words died in my throat. He loved me so completely, trusted me so absolutely, I couldn't bear to see that love turn to disappointment when he learned the truth. Dr. Martinez recommended immediate fertility treatments, but the success rates for someone with my condition were less than 15%. Even with aggressive intervention, the chances were slim and getting smaller every month that passed. That's when I made the first decision that would eventually destroy everything I held dear. Instead of telling John the truth, I decided to buy myself time by exploring every possible option, even if it meant keeping secrets from the person I loved most in the world. The writing lesson started as a way to cope with the stress and depression that consumed me after the diagnosis. I needed something, anything, to distract me from the constant anxiety about my failing body and my uncertain future. Emma really does have a ranch, and she'd mentioned several times that I should try horseback riding to help with stress. But Emma's riding instructor had moved away, so she recommended Oliver's ranch instead. He's the best teacher in the area, she said. Really patient and understanding. Perfect for beginners. Oliver was nothing like what I expected. Rugged and quiet, with gentle hands and kind eyes that seemed to understand pain without needing explanations. He'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and there was something in his manner that spoke to the grief I was carrying. At first it really was just riding lessons. Oliver taught me how to sit properly in the saddle, how to communicate with the horses, how to find peace in the rhythm of their movement. For 2 hours every weekend I could forget about my failing ovaries and just exist in the moment. But Oliver was also the first person in months who looked at me and didn't see a potential mother. He saw a woman learning something new, challenging herself, growing stronger. When I was with him, I wasn't John's wife who can't get pregnant. I was just Sharon, learning to trust a 1,000-pound animal and finding strength I didn't know I possessed. The attraction developed slowly, so gradually that I didn't recognize it until it was already too dangerous. Oliver would adjust my posture, his hands warm and steady on my shoulders. He'd walk beside my horse, talking about ranch life and his philosophy about working with animals. He listened when I talked about feeling lost and uncertain about my future, though I couldn't tell him the real reasons why. I told myself I was just enjoying a friendship, that the flutter in my stomach when Oliver smiled was just gratitude for having someone who made me feel capable and strong. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself the same way I was lying to John. The first time Oliver kissed me, we were standing in the barn after a particularly challenging lesson. I'd finally managed to get my horse to respond properly to my commands, and Oliver was proud of my progress. "You're stronger than you think," he said, and then his lips were on mine and everything else disappeared. I should have stopped it there. I should have gone home and confessed everything to John, the diagnosis, the fear, the confusion, the attraction to another man. But instead, I let myself fall into something that felt like hope for the first time in months. Oliver made me feel alive again. When John looked at me, he saw the wife who might never give him children, even though he didn't know that's what he was seeing. When Oliver looked at me, he saw a woman worth wanting, worth pursuing, worth loving for who she was rather than what she might produce. I justified the affair by telling myself it was temporary, that I was just taking comfort where I could find it while I figured out how to handle my medical situation. Oliver believed I was separated from John, practically divorced, just waiting for the paperwork to finalize. It wasn't technically true, but it wasn't completely false either. I felt separated from John by the enormous secret I was keeping. The deeper I fell into the relationship with Oliver, the harder it became to imagine telling him the truth. How could I explain that I was still living with my husband, still sharing his bed, still playing the role of the devoted wife while carrying on an affair? How could I tell him that part of my attraction to him was rooted in desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, I could conceive a child with him that I couldn't conceive with John? The medical research I'd done suggested that sometimes fertility issues were partner-specific. Maybe John and I were simply incompatible in ways that prevented conception. Maybe with a different partner, my failing ovaries might still produce one last viable egg. I know how calculated and manipulative that sounds now, but at the time it felt like survival. I was drowning in the knowledge that my body was betraying me, that time was running out, that every month brought me closer to permanent infertility. Oliver represented possibility, hope, a chance that I might still become a mother before it was too late. The months I spent with Oliver were the happiest I'd felt since receiving my diagnosis. We would ride together across his property, talking about everything except the complicated truth of my situation. He told me about his wife, about how cancer had taken her slowly and cruelly, about how he'd never expected to feel attraction to another woman again. "You brought me back to life," he said one afternoon as we sat by his pond, watching the horses graze nearby. "I thought that part of me died with Sarah." Those words should have made me happy, but instead they filled me with guilt. Oliver was falling in love with someone who didn't really exist, the Sharon who was free and available, who could build a future with him without complications or lies. The real Sharon was trapped in a web of medical crises and desperate deceptions that grew more tangled every day. Meanwhile, at home with John, I was becoming a stranger to myself. I would lie in bed beside my husband, the man who loved me unconditionally, while thinking about Oliver's hands on my skin. I would make dinner and ask about John's day while calculating which days of my cycle offered the best chance of conception if I could manage to be with Oliver during my fertile window. The guilt was eating me alive, but the fear was stronger than the guilt. Fear that my marriage would end if John learned about my condition. Fear that Oliver would reject me if he knew the truth about my situation. Fear that I was running out of time to experience motherhood, the thing I'd wanted most since I was a little girl playing with dolls. Dr. Martinez had recommended that I start fertility treatments immediately, but I kept postponing them. The success rates were so low, and the process would be impossible to hide from John. How could I explain sudden medical appointments, hormone injections, invasive procedures? John would ask questions, want to be involved, and then the whole truth would come out. So instead, I gambled everything on the possibility that Oliver might be the answer to my fertility problems. I tracked my ovulation obsessively, made sure to be with Oliver during my most fertile days, and prayed that my failing body would cooperate just long enough to give me the child I desperately wanted. The irony is that John would have been supportive if I'd told him the truth from the beginning. He loved me enough to face any medical challenge together. But by the time I realized that, I was already too deep in lies to find my way back to honesty. The day everything unraveled started like any other. I was getting ready to go to Oliver's ranch, telling John the familiar lie about visiting Emma, when I noticed he was acting strangely. He seemed distracted, almost suspicious, watching me more carefully than usual as I gathered my things. "Have a good time with Emma," he said, but there was something in his tone that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I almost canceled the trip to Oliver's that day. Some instinct was screaming at me to stay home, to finally tell John the truth, to stop living this double life that was destroying me from the inside out. But Oliver had texted that morning saying he had something special planned, and I couldn't resist the pull of those few hours where I could pretend to be someone else, someone whose life wasn't falling apart. At Oliver's ranch, we rode further than usual, to a secluded meadow where he'd set up a picnic. "I've been thinking about our future," he said as we sat on the blanket he'd spread under an old oak tree. "I know you're still dealing with your divorce, but I want you to know that I'm serious about this. About us." My heart should have soared at those words, but instead I felt sick. Oliver was talking about a future that could never exist, making plans based on lies I'd told him about my availability and freedom. He was a good man who deserved honesty, and I was giving him nothing but deception. "Oliver," I started, knowing I had to begin telling him the truth, but he stopped me with a kiss that tasted like possibility and heartbreak all at once. That evening when I returned home, John was waiting in the living room with papers spread across the coffee table. His face was stone, his eyes cold in a way I'd never seen before. "We need to talk," he said, and I knew with absolute certainty that my world was about to end. The papers were printouts of text messages between Oliver and me, copies of my location data, photographs of us together at the ranch. John had evidence of everything, not just the affair, but the elaborate lies I'd constructed to hide it. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I wanted to explain everything, the diagnosis, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe Oliver could give me the child John and I had never been able to create together. But looking at John's devastated face, I realized that no explanation could undo the betrayal he was feeling. 3 months, I whispered, which was true but felt like the smallest, most inadequate truth I could offer. 3 months of lies, John said. 3 months of looking me in the eye and lying every single day. The worst part wasn't his anger, it was his disappointment. John had loved me completely, trusted me absolutely, and I had taken that trust and shattered it into pieces too small to ever put back together. I tried to explain about the medical diagnosis, about my fear of telling him, about the desperation that had driven me to make such terrible choices. But my words sounded hollow even to me. How could I expect John to understand when I barely understood it myself? "You could have told me," John said quietly. "Whatever you were going through, whatever you were afraid of, you could have told me. We could have faced it together." He was right, and that knowledge was more painful than all the anger and accusations in the world. I had chosen lies over trust, deception over partnership, and in doing so, I had destroyed the best thing in my life. The divorce papers arrived the next day, along with copies of all the evidence John had gathered. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing that same evidence shared with my parents, my sister Emma, my friends from church and work. Within days, my entire social network knew about the affair. The women who had looked up to me for marriage advice were horrified by my hypocrisy. The church community that had trusted me with volunteer leadership positions felt betrayed by my deception. My parents, who had always been proud of their perfect daughter, were devastated to learn how far I had fallen from the values they'd raised me with. My boss at the law firm called me into his office the morning after John delivered the evidence package. "Sharon," he said sadly, "you understand we can't keep you on after this. The nature of our business requires absolute trust and integrity. Our clients need to know they can rely on us, and your personal conduct has created a liability we can't ignore." Losing my job was devastating, but losing my family's respect was worse. My parents couldn't even look at me when I tried to explain about the medical diagnosis that had started this whole nightmare. My mother, who had dreamed of being a grandmother, cried when she learned that my fertility issues might have prevented that dream even without the affair. "You should have told us," my father said, echoing John's words. "We would have helped you through this. We would have supported you and John together." But the damage was done and there was no going back. The worst confrontation came when Oliver learned the truth. Someone from town, I never found out who, told him that I wasn't separated or getting divorced, that I was still very much married and living with my husband. Oliver drove to my house the day after John's church revelation, his face a mask of hurt and betrayal. "Was any of it real?" he asked, standing on my front porch while neighbors whispered and stared from their windows. I wanted to tell him that my feelings for him had been real, that the happiness I'd found with him had been the only genuine thing in my life during those terrible months. But how could I explain that I'd used him, manipulated him, built our entire relationship on lies about my availability and intentions? "I never meant to hurt you," I said, which was true but completely inadequate. "But you did hurt me," Oliver replied. "You let me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist. You made me believe in a future that was never possible. You used my grief and loneliness against me." The pain in his eyes was unbearable. Oliver was a good man who had already lost one woman he loved to circumstances beyond his control. Now he was losing another woman to lies and manipulation that he never deserved to experience. After Oliver left, I sat in my empty house. John had moved out immediately after filing the divorce papers, and tried to understand how I had become the kind of person who could cause so much pain to people who had loved me. The answer was fear. Fear had driven every terrible decision I'd made. Fear of losing John's love when he learned about my medical condition. Fear of dying childless and unfulfilled. Fear of facing my uncertain future without the comfort of denial and fantasy. But fear wasn't an excuse for the choices I'd made. I could have chosen honesty over deception, trust over manipulation, partnership over betrayal. Instead, I had chosen the path that seemed easier in the moment but led to devastation for everyone involved. The divorce proceedings were swift and merciless. John's lawyer presented all the evidence of my affair and financial deception. I had been diverting small amounts of money from our joint account to pay for new clothes and personal expenses related to maintaining my relationship with Oliver. The judge was not sympathetic to a woman who had systematically betrayed her marriage while stealing marital assets to fund her affair. I lost the house, most of our shared belongings, and was ordered to pay John's legal fees. More importantly, I lost any hope of reconciliation with the man I had loved more than my own life. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court was perhaps the most painful part of the entire process. Dr. Harrison, a clinical psychologist, spent weeks analyzing my behavior and motivations. Her final report described me as someone with narcissistic tendencies and a pattern of manipulative behavior driven by underlying anxiety and fear of abandonment. Reading that evaluation was like looking in a mirror and seeing a monster. Was I really the selfish, calculating person Dr. Harrison described? Or was I just a frightened woman who had made terrible choices when faced with an impossible situation? The truth, I realized, was probably both. 6 months after that devastating church service, I was living in a studio apartment across town, working at a retail job that barely covered my expenses, and facing the reality that I was completely alone. John had moved on with impressive speed, already dating someone new according to mutual friends who felt compelled to update me on his happiness. Oliver had sold his ranch and moved to Colorado, unable to handle the scandal and embarrassment in our small community. The last I heard, he was working at a guest ranch, teaching tourists to ride horses and trying to rebuild a life away from the memories of our doomed relationship. My parents had started speaking to me again, but our relationship was strained and formal. They were polite but distant, treating me like an acquaintance rather than their daughter. Emma had cut off contact completely, unable to forgive me for using her name as cover for my deception. The church community that had once welcomed me with open arms now regarded me with a mixture of pity and disgust. I stopped attending services after too many cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. But the most devastating loss wasn't my marriage, my home, my job, or my social connections. The most devastating loss was the future I had destroyed through my own actions. The family I had hoped to create, the children I had wanted so desperately, the life of love and partnership I had taken for granted until it was gone. Dr. Martinez had been calling regularly, urging me to begin fertility treatments immediately if I still hoped to conceive. But what was the point of preserving my fertility when I had no partner, no stable home, no support system to help raise a child? Your biological clock doesn't care about your personal circumstances, she said during one particularly difficult appointment. If you want to be a mother someday, you need to act now, regardless of everything else that's happening in your life. The idea of single motherhood terrified me, but the idea of permanent childlessness terrified me more. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, I decided to use the last of my savings to freeze my eggs, preserving whatever fertility I had left while I tried to rebuild my life. The process was physically and emotionally brutal. Daily hormone injections that made me sick and emotional. Constant medical appointments that I had to hide from my employer. The knowledge that I was spending money I couldn't afford on a procedure that might not even work. But 3 weeks into the treatment cycle, Dr. Martinez called with news that changed everything. "Sharon," she said, her voice excited, "you don't need to continue the egg freezing process. You're pregnant." I stared at the phone, certain I had misheard. "That's not possible. I haven't been with anyone in months." "The conception date suggests this happened right around the time of your separation from your husband," Dr. Martinez explained. "Sometimes stress and major life changes can actually trigger ovulation in women with your condition. It's rare, but it happens." I did the math, counting back to my last encounter with Oliver, and realized she was right. In the midst of all the chaos and devastation, my body had managed to do the one thing I had wanted most in the world: conceive a child. The irony was overwhelming. I had destroyed my marriage, lost my family and friends, ruined multiple lives, all in pursuit of a pregnancy that had happened naturally just when everything else was falling apart. But the timing meant that I couldn't be certain whether John or Oliver was the father. The possibility existed that this child, the baby I had wanted so desperately, might have been conceived during my last desperate attempt to save my marriage, or during my final weekend with Oliver before everything collapsed. I called John first, knowing I owed him the truth about the pregnancy regardless of paternity. He listened in silence as I explained the situation, the medical timeline, the uncertainty about the baby's father. "I don't want anything from you," I said quickly. I just thought you had the right to know in case the baby is yours. John was quiet for a long time before responding. Sharon, I appreciate you telling me, but I can't be involved in this. Whatever happens with this baby, you're on your own. I'm sorry, but I have to protect myself and my future. I understood his position even though it broke my heart. John had already given me more chances than I deserved. He owed me nothing, especially not forgiveness or support for a pregnancy that might have resulted from the affair that destroyed our marriage. Calling Oliver was harder. He had moved to Colorado specifically to escape the pain I had caused him. The last thing he wanted was to hear from me again. Why are you telling me this? He asked after I explained about the pregnancy. Because if this baby is yours, you have the right to know, I said. I don't expect anything from you. I just thought you should have the choice about whether to be involved. Oliver was quiet for even longer than John had been. Finally he said, Sharon, I can't trust anything you tell me anymore. Even if that baby is mine, I don't want to be connected to you in any way. You need to handle this on your own. So that's what I did. I faced the pregnancy alone, working retail jobs that barely covered my expenses, living in a tiny apartment with no family or friends to support me through the most challenging time of my life. The prenatal appointments were lonely affairs where I sat in waiting rooms full of happy couples and tried not to think about how different things might have been if I had made better choices. The pregnancy was difficult. My body, already compromised by my medical condition, struggled with the additional stress of carrying a child. At 20 weeks, I finally learned the baby's gender, a girl, and had to face the reality that I would be raising a daughter as a single mother with no support system and limited resources. The future I had once imagined, full of love and partnership and family gatherings, had been replaced by a stark reality of struggle and isolation. But despite everything, the loneliness, the financial stress, the physical discomfort, the uncertainty about paternity, I found myself genuinely excited about becoming a mother. This baby, conceived in the midst of chaos and born into difficult circumstances, represented the one thing I had gotten right in a year of terrible mistakes. The delivery was long and complicated, and I labored alone except for the medical staff. No husband holding my hand, no family members waiting anxiously in the corridor, no friends bringing flowers and congratulations. Just me and the daughter I had wanted so desperately that I had destroyed my life trying to conceive her. When they placed Emma, I named her after my sister, hoping someday we might reconcile. In my arms, I felt a love so fierce and protective that it took my breath away. She was perfect, healthy, beautiful, and completely mine in a way that nothing else had ever been. Looking at her tiny face, I could see features that might belong to John or Oliver, but mostly she just looked like herself, a new person with her own future, uncontaminated by the mistakes that had brought her into existence. The paternity question haunted me for weeks after Emma's birth. I could have requested DNA tests from both men, but ultimately I decided that knowledge wouldn't change anything. Neither John nor Oliver wanted to be involved in our lives. This baby was mine alone, and I was determined to be enough for her. Now, 2 years later, Emma and I have built a quiet life together. I work as a receptionist at a medical clinic, the only employer willing to hire someone with my reputation, and we live in a small apartment across town from all the places that hold memories of my former life. Emma is walking now, saying her first words, filling our tiny space with laughter and chaos and unconditional love. She doesn't know yet that her father is a mystery, that her mother destroyed multiple lives in the process of bringing her into existence, that we're alone because of choices I made before she was born. Someday I'll have to explain all of that to her, but for now she's just a happy toddler who thinks I'm the center of the universe. Her love is pure and uncomplicated, untainted by knowledge of my failures and betrayals. I think about John sometimes, wondering if he's happy with his new wife, if they've started the family he always wanted. I hope they have, and I hope he never wonders about Emma, never tortures himself with questions about whether she might be his daughter. I think about Oliver too, hoping he's found peace in Colorado, hoping the scandal of our affair hasn't followed him to his new life. He deserved so much better than the deception and manipulation I gave him. My parents see Emma occasionally, they can't resist their granddaughter completely, but our relationship remains strained. They love Emma fiercely, but they still struggle to forgive me for the choices that brought her into existence. Emma might be John's biological daughter, or Oliver's, or some combination of both men's features that creates the illusion of resemblance. But she's mine in every way that matters, in love, in responsibility, in the fierce protection I feel when I look at her sleeping face. The cost of her existence was everything else I valued in life. My marriage, my family relationships, my friendships, my reputation, my financial security, my place in the community I once called home. I paid the ultimate price for the desperate choices I made when fear overwhelmed my judgment. But holding Emma in my arms, watching her discover the world with wonder and joy, I find it impossible to regret the path that led to her existence. I destroyed my life pursuing motherhood, and in the end I got exactly what I wanted, just not in any way I could have imagined. Some nights, when Emma is sleeping peacefully in her crib and the apartment is quiet, I allow myself to grieve for the life I lost. The marriage that should have lasted forever, the friendships that should have supported me through difficult times, the family relationships that should have celebrated Emma's existence instead of being complicated by shame and disappointment. But most nights I just feel grateful. Grateful that my broken body managed to conceive the child I wanted so desperately. Grateful that Emma is healthy and happy despite the chaos surrounding her conception. Grateful that I get to be her mother, even if it means being a mother alone. The woman I used to be, the one who organized church events and gave marriage advice and presented herself as morally superior, that woman was a fraud who justified terrible choices with elaborate rationalizations. The woman I am now is struggling and isolated and facing an uncertain future, but at least she's honest about her limitations and mistakes. I made choices that hurt people I loved, destroyed relationships that should have been treasured, and betrayed trust that was given freely and completely. I'll spend the rest of my life living with the consequences of those choices. But I'm also raising a daughter who represents hope and new beginnings and the possibility that someone can emerge from the wreckage of terrible circumstances and still create a life worth living. Emma doesn't know yet that she was conceived in betrayal and born into scandal. All she knows is that she's loved completely and unconditionally by the mother who wanted her so desperately that she risked everything to bring her into existence. That love will have to be enough because it's all I have left to give. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Maybe YouTube will no longer offer you my channel, so subscribe to it by clicking subscribe on the right under the video to receive new interesting stories. Also on the right of the video there is a playlist with other interesting stories that you can listen to, and you can also write in the comments what stories you would like to see on the channel.